gathering in celebration of many years of wonderful work and collaboration. So we're very happy to see you all here. My name is Teresa Healy. I've known Dick and Edur as well for a number of years now, and through our work on Mexico and North American integration. So it's a great honor for me to be able to sit here and facilitate this conversation this evening. Thank you all so much for coming. And I hope that you've had a chance to look at the book if you haven't already got your own copy. But there are copies at the back on the side there. It's a beautiful book. Fernwood has done a terrific job in producing this book, and it's a really wonderful thing for us to be able to sit here tonight and discuss it. So congratulations to Edur in absentia, and to Dick. We're really happy to be here celebrating with you tonight. So maybe I could introduce the panel that we have assembled. I'll tell you a little bit about Edur, who's not able to be with us tonight. Edur Velasco is a former Secretary General of SITUAN, that's the Sindicato Independiente de Trabajadores de la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, which is the independent union of workers of the Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico. He has been very much engaged in one of Mexico's few democratic unions. He's a professor of law and labor economics at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Azcapotzalco.
It took me 3 years to learn that.
And he's a long-time activist in the struggle for democratic trade unionism and social justice in Mexico. And Dick Roman was a professor of sociology at the University of Toronto for many years, and he is a fellow at the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean at York University. He's also a member of the Socialist Project and the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. So what a combination of a great basis for a wonderful partnership. Continental Crucible, big business, workers, and unions in the transformation of North America. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Dick to introduce the book to us. We look forward to his presentation, and then after that we'll hear from the panel.
Thanks very much, Teresa. Thank you all for coming. I'd like, first of all, to thank Fernwood for publishing the book and doing such a beautiful job. And I also want to urge you to read the preface by Mel Watkins, because it's a gem. It's wonderfully succinct and a wonderful preface. And I'd like to thank the members of the panel for reading the book and participating. I'm looking forward to their comments and critique. And I want to especially thank my wife and family for their patience and support in a long time of production. The book itself really comes out of just before NAFTA. I met Edur at a conference opposing NAFTA, and we realized very quickly that we were on this exact same wavelength in terms of perspective, in terms of a class struggle perspective on how things work. And we decided to write a really quick, short book, this was over 20 years ago, on the Mexican labor movement, because it's a very peculiar, very special labor movement. And we thought it would be important for North American, Canadian, US activists to read it. Well, that book is still in progress. This book is a spin-off of that book. We've had a number of spin-offs. It's been fruitful, and maybe someday that book will get done. Maybe not. This book is an attempt, this book is really divided into 3 related parts, but each of which has its own distinctive aspects. The first part is an attempt to show that neoliberalism didn't just happen because of the so-called globalization or because of economic pressures. The capitalist class organized itself, at least the leading statesmen and their organic intellectuals worked to organize the capitalist class to impose its worldview and its agenda on North American society. I've been surprised over the years at how there's been a neglect of looking at the role of the peak business organizations in shaping our society. They get very little mention. The most powerful organizations in each of the three countries, the Business Council on National Issues in Canada, Business Roundtable in the US, the Council of Mexican Businessmen, these tremendously powerful groups that we argue and try to show really have shaped the neoliberal transformation have really been neglected. I wanted to put faces on the engineers of the neoliberal transformation. Also, we argue in this first part, in the fourth chapter, that NAFTA, and before that the Free Trade Agreement, did not come about, it came about, it wasn't imposed by the US on junior partners, but a lot of the initiative actually came from the Canadian and Mexican capitalist class, welcomed by the US, not imposed by the US. And we also argue that trade agreements, something that's argued much more extensively in Leo and Sam's book, trade agreements are instruments for carrying out the class struggle inside countries. They have very little to do with trade. The middle section of the book is perhaps unique in that it compares the two sets of binational working class relationships. The Mexican working class, which has long been a working class that exists in two nations, in two national markets, the US, two national labor markets, the US and Mexico. It straddles the border. And on the other hand, the so-called international unions, the Canadian-US unions, that also straddle the border in a different direction with no strong interconnections. The last part of the book discusses the dilemmas and politics of working class fight back against the capitalist offensive in North America. While the capitalists in the three countries were changing the whole rules of the game, the working class, the main organizations of the working class, the trade unions, were battling as if they were still in a different system. They were battling through narrow conceptions of economism, of sectionalism, and not realizing or not knowing how to break through the fog of their old conceptions and ways of doing things. And because of that, have suffered tremendous defeats in all three countries. The last part of the book explores some of the dilemmas inherent in trade unionism in a capitalist society, but also specific to the new context of capitalist globalization. And it discusses the limitations of the forms of solidarity that have existed today, and the need for a new kind of solidarity, a solidarity of common struggle. Changes that require transformations in the cultures and practices of trade unions themselves in all three countries, and in Mexico, where most trade unions are gangster, state-linked, more or less unions, there really has to be a new labor movement developed. And the other part, the other aspect, just briefly to mention about the last part of the book, is NAFTA brought together three countries. Two of them are stable, relatively stable capitalist democracies. regimes that unfortunately have a tremendous degree of legitimacy to most of the population. The Mexican regime is one in the midst of a deep, deep crisis of legitimacy, of power, internal warfare. It's an explosive partner in the NAFTA triad. And our hope is that the book contributes to understanding both the capitalist offensive and the need to find continental, international, class-wide ways of fighting back. Thank you.
My name is Leo Panitch. Leo is a professor at the at York University Political Science Department, and I had the great honor of studying with Leo many years ago, and so it's been, again, a wonderful, wonderful thing for me to be here introducing him, and I'm looking forward to his comments very much on this work.
Well, let me, first of all, congratulate Dick and through him, Edur, for producing, really, I think, the definitive analysis of what NAFTA was all about. And I can do no better than read the blurb that I sent Dick for the book. This tremendously insightful book not only offers a rare analysis of the intertwining political economies of all three countries that make up North America, but does so in a manner that tellingly reveals the specific nature of the American empire and how it is affected by class struggles within each state. And as Dick said at the beginning, what is so important about this book is it finally nails the notion that NAFTA was imposed on Mexico and Canada by the Reagan administration, not by the Clinton administration. And it's very aware that, in fact, the most difficult passage for NAFTA, for the FTA, particularly for NAFTA, was through the American state, through the American Congress. It shows that the American bourgeoisie was not that excited about the FTA and NAFTA, mainly because they don't think much about Canada. What it really shows, and Dick stressed that as well in his opening remarks, and this is repeated again and again, and rightfully so, is that the Canadian capitalist class and the Mexican capitalist class should not be seen as comprador bourgeoisies or junior partners. They are very strong social forces in their own right. And they are internationalizing and transnationalizing and using their location in Canadian and Mexican society and the support of the Canadian and Mexican states to transnationalize. As they show that these classes were the main actors, these domestic capitalist classes were the main actors in making NAFTA happen in their own states. They show that the reason for this, above all, of course, partly it was to ensure that they would continue to have access for their exports to the United States in the face of the way the Reagan administration in particular played the card of protectionism, never needing it at all, in the 1980s. And sure, they did it in order to ensure that Canadian foreign direct investment would continue to be the largest foreign direct investment in the United States. People don't think about that. It doesn't make Canada imperialist vis-a-vis the United States, but Canadian capital owns more of the United States than any other foreign capital. But the main reason was to constitutionalize property rights in an international treaty. And the reason they wanted to constitutionalize property rights was to prevent another national energy program and to prevent the strength of NAFTA. Now that was a matter, of course, of preventing left nationalist forces in Canada from slightly altering the relationship between Canada and the American Empire. But what it also was about, of course, was smashing the trade union militancy of the 70s and the allied social movement militancy that was so important by the 1980s, especially in a socialist-led feminist movement in Canada. That was the point of it. And it was also the point of it in Mexico. And in that sense, both the Mexican bourgeoisie and the American state realized that what free trade was all about was crystallizing a certain balance of social forces in Mexico. And Sam and I, in our book on the making of global capitalism, have a quote from Larry Summers. He was then, at the time NAFTA was passed, the Undersecretary for International Affairs in the U.S. Treasury. He went on to become Treasury Secretary, of course. And he claimed that NAFTA, quote, resulted in a profound change in the internal political dynamics in Mexico in favor of the progressive forces that believed in the market and friendship with the United States, as opposed to the forces that believed more in socialism and in opposition to the United States. So this book is so penetrating precisely because it understands these international commercial treaties in terms of the way they alter the domestic balance of forces inside each country. And it's terrific for that reason. And you know, as Dick said to me when he came in tonight, now that we both read each other's books, you know, we've been political comrades and intellectual ones for some time. It's remarkable how much we were thinking on the same lines as we were writing these things. And their understanding of the American empire, like Sam's and mine, is that it's an empire by invitation. That capitalist classes around the world invite the American state to play the role it does in their social formations. Of course, they emulate American capital in many respects. The book begins with the Business Roundtable in the United States and the way in which it organizes the American ruling class through the 1970s, but it doesn't do it in a way that the Business Roundtable then imposes free trade on Canada. It's rather that the Canadian ruling class looks to the Business Roundtable and says, hey, that's a good way of organizing. The Americans know what they're doing. We should do that here. And as it tells that story, it's very, very insightful. The theoretical punch, I'll just end with this, I'll let my comrades who know much more about the labor movement than I do talk about what the book has to say about changing trade unions in all three countries. The theoretical punch of the book, and is very important given that it comes from people who have spent their intellectual lives writing on Latin America, is that dependency theory, the theory of the development of underdevelopment, which was the common way of understanding imperialism in the second half of the 20th century, doesn't take us anywhere in the contemporary world. That what is taking place in a country like Mexico, and indeed a great many of the large capitalist countries of the South, is a classical form of capitalist development. That doesn't mean it's pretty. It's ugly, in fact. It's incredibly exploitative, but it's capitalist development. It's not the development of underdevelopment. And that's a very important theoretical punch. And it has big political implications, because it means you think in terms of changing those states through class struggle, rather than in terms of a core periphery relationship in the world, with the third world overthrowing the first world's dominance. There's no change unless class struggles within each of the world states change their own societies and their own states in the process. I just want to end with this, because one shouldn't let get away being just praised tonight. He has to be roasted a bit. Dick has finally atoned for a political act that I always rib him for, and which is written up in Michael Harrington's memoirs. If any of you want to go back, I don't think Dick knows this. Dick was delegated to go to, I think it was the Port Huron meeting, as a young man of the Port Huron meeting of the SDS in 1960, I guess it was. Delegated to go there and ensure that the Port Huron statement not be passed until the SDS took a position on whether the Soviet Union was a degenerate worker state or a state capitalist society. I'm not sure I'm telling that story exactly right.
Bureaucratic collective.
A bureaucratic collective. and Michael Harrington actually tells this story and names it and apologizes for it in his memoir. Dick has apologized for it privately, but I think he's finally atoned for it in this marvelous book.
Free at last.
Sciacchitano is a former labor lawyer and organizer. She's a writer and a labor educator, and we're very, very, very happy for me to meet Katherine today and to hear her presentation as well.
I want to start by just thanking Dick and Edur for writing a book on just this urgent matter of international labor solidarity. I mean, it's terribly important. I'm not going to talk a lot about the book itself. I do want to say that for me, there were many useful parts of the book, but the most useful part of the book was the wonderful description that the two of you have on the Mexican state and politics in Mexico. It's a wonderful history. I've read it once. I'm going to read it several times. So even if there was nothing else in the book, I mean, that would be very valuable for many of us who don't know enough about the Mexican state. I'm going to limit my comments to the U.S. labor movement, which is where I come from. And I'm going to start with some personal reflections. One of the ways of framing this book, am I doing okay? Thanks. One of the ways of framing this book is about the limits of collective bargaining, at least the current framework of collective bargaining in North America, given the framework of NAFTA. So I read it this way partly because 20 years ago I wrote a paper just in thinking about the limits of collective bargaining in the United States, in the U.S. labor movement. And I had a very basic argument that I made about this. The U.S. labor movement is highly decentralized. You don't just bargain employer by employer, you bargain site by site. And it really makes it impossibly expensive to organize and bargain for workers who work for small employers. Since that's over 50% of the workforce, you have removed 50% of the U.S. workforce from unions before you even start. There are statutory exclusions of employees, certain kinds of workers who are not entitled to the protection of collective bargaining at all. So you're down to about 30% maximum right there. And then you have a growing contingent workforce, which is very hard to organize in traditional forms. So all of this was true even 20 years ago. So I looked at a situation which is a very weak situation, where you have very, very strong limits on union densities, which are excluding very important parts of the base for labor at the time, which really weakens the labor movement, and really impossible to address certain key issues through bargaining. The issues I looked at the time are still that way. Pensions, you don't have portable pensions in the United States, and healthcare, major problems that can only really be solved politically. So I thought up a specific but flexible form of organization that I thought would work, that did not necessarily entail collective bargaining. I don't need to go into it now, but it involved a form of organization that would combine workplace struggle with a kind of geographically rooted struggle over economic issues. At the time it was economic development that I thought was important. I think it still is. And I thought about where is the U.S. labor movement and what can the institutional labor movement do? And I kind of looked at my historical watch and I thought to myself, in about 10 years, which was about at the time, about the turn of the millennium, the U.S. labor movement is going to be in serious shape. Union density is going to be, I thought, maybe close to 5%. It's going to be in serious financial shape. Well, I was close. I was about 10 years off from those problems. What I saw the task of the U.S. labor movement really as being was to seed the next movement, to seed these next forms of organization, because workers just don't simply sit down and stop struggling when they're assaulted in the way that they're being assaulted. So I thought, well, you take a labor movement that's still a wealthy movement and let's seed the next one without trying to control it. The other task I thought existed for the institutional labor movement was to try to make one labor movement out of two. So you have a growing contingent workforce at all levels of income, and then you have the full-time employed workers, and they don't see their interests as being very similar. So you have sort of a disparate, different directions going on there. So this is the way I was looking at it at the time. To my So that's the framework one of the frameworks that I came to this book with. And I think that this book makes a very similar argument. Very clear argument that the needs of North American workers have outgrown the structures of the North American labor movement. And that to build power, what we really have to do together, collectively, is to build one labor movement out of three. Immense, but that's actually what's needed given what we're facing. And you do have, you talk about some specific structures. I mean, there are international unions shared by US workers and Canadian workers, although there need to be a lot of development in that relationship, but that's one place to begin building. And then in the US, what you have is a very integrated labor market between the United States and Mexico, and that's a base to begin building the solidarity from as well. So one final striking point that I noticed both in the book and also when you were speaking yesterday at the labor educators conference that I was at, was again this hope that somehow the wealth of the US and the Canadian labor movements could be directed at really seeding and supporting the growth of this next labor movement, the new labor movement, and specifically supporting Mexican workers. So there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that, at least, and again I'm focusing on the United States here, that this might be an overstatement, I'm saying this optimistically, that the AFL-CIO has made a determination to try to begin seeding the next labor movement. And I put it that way because there are all sorts of interesting alliances they're trying to form with people in worker centers, working with immigrant organizing groups. But this came with a recent statement by Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO, that it is long overdue, but probably an unnecessary statement at this point, that the US system of workplace representation is completely broken. Right? So that was a pretty astounding statement for him to make. That's the good news, right? That's being acknowledged, and that there are resources being put into somewhat different forms of organizing. The bad news is that this is happening 20 years after the need was really clear, and that also happens to be, NAFTA happened to be taking place. By the way, around the same time as I was doing this analysis of the labor movement. So it's a very long time past the time that the North American labor movement should have been looking at really seriously strengthening our solidarity. So there's a mismatch of timelines here, which is going on, which is significant for what we're trying to do. What I want to do is just end with a few comments just on a few more mismatches that I see, not to be pessimistic, but hopefully to add those few practical points. And there really are points where there's work that needs to be done, but there's really serious education certainly within the U.S. labor movement that needs to be done on all of these points. So first of all is the mismatch that Dick and Edur have been highlighting. Capital operates nationally and also transnationally. The state operates nationally and also transnationally. Labor structures are primarily national. Now, even in the international unions that you have between the US and Canada, there are meetings that go on that actually are international meetings. There's interchange of officers. There is practical work that gets done in common. But the members from day to day are focused nationally. And again, let me say in the United States, nationally, very, very locally. And so there are huge issues of union democracy there, but also of nationalism that have to be addressed to build the foundation for what you're talking about. And this is something that everyone needs to be working on, labor educators and as well as who in the United States exists both within and outside of unions, need to really be working on. Another mismatch is that to the extent that labor actually has an international focus, it is focused almost entirely on collective bargaining. Now, the assault on labor by capital is not simply focused on collective bargaining. It is focused on everything, on every level of workers' economic existence and life. And you can see in terms of the structure that NAFTA creates in North America. It goes very far beyond just a very weak and structured for labor rights. What it really does is it systematically undoes kind of framework that used to be possible of national regulation of capital that could be used at times, in certain times in certain places, to actually use capital to create jobs and to create a certain kind of still capitalist development, but still development. So NAFTA really undoes that, and soon the Trans-Pacific Partnership will be doing that, and NAFTA is included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we have to learn, those Western unions have to learn to go to really, to be looking beyond that collective bargaining, to really attacking that agenda head on of capital. We really need to rebuild, not just stop the TPP, not just try to undo NAFTA to the extent it can be undone, but to really rebuild a framework of regulation that actually, a transnational framework for regulation that actually can meet the needs of workers. I've got two more. Thanks. One just very brief thing is that within the collective bargaining framework, there are supply chains, there are integrated supply chains throughout North America. And those have to be organized. In order for those to be organized, there needs to be a tremendous amount of coordination between the unions to map the supply chains. Who are the employers? Where are they? Most of these supply chains are non-union, and they will involve the coordination of many different unions to organize these supply chains. So that's a task that members have to be educated about the necessity of, because it'll take a long time, a lot of resources, and nothing like that has really happened at this point. And the last thing I'll just mention briefly, because I'm out of time, is that really there's a mismatch between the ferocity of the attacks and labor's understanding of the attacks. And in the United States, I can see, I mean, the penny has not dropped. A lot of people think that the bad time is about to pass, or will soon pass, or that there's some sort of legitimate disagreement going on about how to fix a problem. There is no legitimate disagreement going on about how to fix a problem. This is workers being plowed under, and there's an attempt to do it once and for all. So, unions really need to find the language and the voice. The analysis is out there now. I mean, we are so much further ahead now than we were 20 years ago. We have so much analysis with which to do this, but we need our voice to do it. Thank you.
Schenk is currently teaching at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the University of Toronto. Before teaching at U of T, he was the research director of the Ontario Federation of Labour for many years. And last year, he was given the Sefton Award for contributions to industrial relations by the University of Toronto.
Thank you. I guess I would have to agree that the orientation of this book is terrific. There's much to agree with. It's insightful, and there's also much to learn from it. And I pick up on Leo's point around NAFTA. I think that the discussion of NAFTA is really fascinating, and it's succinct enough that you can get to it quite quickly. Right from the start in the introduction, it states that the crucible of U.S., Canada, and Mexico is heating up. I would have to say that I'm glad to hear that this is the case. It is a distinct possibility, although at this time I don't see much evidence of it, quite frankly. Class war may be unceasing, as the text says, but it is yet to break out in class revolt. So I think part of what the book is saying is what the potential is, and what the contradictions of our societies in North America should probably end up doing, or at least posing those kinds of questions of class revolt, but I don't think we see it at this moment. Yes, I think it's a good point to make about NAFTA bringing together an explosive third world country with two relatively stable democracies, and there's an interesting discussion around that, as I think there is with the Taft-Hartley laws and the, Landon-Griffin. So there's a lot of things in there that are really good, and I certainly hope we see the kinds of explosions that the book envisions. I think the point made about the relationship between Canadian capitalist class and the American was made by Leo, which is really good, and that is we're a long way from the 1970s. If you're as old as me, you will remember that there was, I think it was Kerry Levitt talked about Canada being the richest underdeveloped country. We had another book which was called The Silent Surrender, and it was about the takeover of Canada by American industry. I think we're a long way from that now, but those were interesting concepts at the time, but it certainly didn't quite pan out that way. There's a section in there on labor militancy which I thought was very good in terms of American workers, Canadian workers, and I'm glad you included some section on Quebec because it has been a bit of a unique labor movement and it's worthwhile. There are a few other comments I wanted to make about the chapter entitled Continental Integration from Below. I thought it was an interesting discussion, and there is a considerable degree of integration, to put it mildly. Yet I would suggest that on some issues I have to think a little bit about what the book says there. For example, you use the notion that Canadian and American workers have long been integrated in the same unions, like you use the example of steel workers, the auto workers, and believe it or not, the laborers. Well, that's true. There is some integration there. But if we looked at the 30s and 40s, when we had hundreds of thousands of workers organizing, they basically organized into the CIO. This was the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Really, whether it was steel or auto was secondary. They were unionizing, and they were doing that through militant tactics, and we had a real viable social movement, right? And what has happened since then? We have less workers in international unions, so-called international unions. We have the CAW. We not only have the public sector like QP and Public Service Alliance, we have the CAW, we have CEP. Many of the constituent parts of the CEP were international unions. And where we have international unions, we have Canadian autonomy in a lot of them. For example, the United Food and Commercial Workers, or say the steelworkers. If you're in the steelworkers, they have an American president, a Canadian president, an American president, a Canadian president. And I've even received phone calls from instructors in steelworker schools in the United States saying, do you know where the steelworker rep is from Canada? We can't teach this class until they come. It's kind of interesting that that's happening. So we've had this whole fight for Canadian autonomy or Canadian independence, which was a progressive fight in many ways. And yet what do we need now? We need almost the opposite, don't we? We need a continental organizations here. So I would just say that I just have some questions around using those three unions that you've used as an example of integration when the direction has sort of been the other way around. What that means for integration, I guess, is another question. I guess one question I would ask then is the example in the text really indicative of integration? And second, is there now less integration given the direction of union membership? I think those are just questions that we need to think about. I'll leave the question of the Mexican working class and the American workforce to those people that know something about it. I certainly concur there that Canadians have created, that capitalists have created continental production chains, which a number of people have mentioned, and the problems that we still face in terms of workforce segmentation, in terms of organizations that are probably inadequate for what the tasks are in front of us, and certainly have led to probably more competitiveness in ideology than they have in terms of class consciousness and solidarity, which we really need. The text speaks of the emergence of a new internationalism, and in North America, a new tri-nationalism. Now, my life has been spent in the Canadian labor movement, more specifically the Ontario labor movement. But I have to say, I've never run into a new tri-nationalism. It doesn't exist in my experience in the labor movement. And I phoned a couple of people in other unions the other day just to find out if they've run into this phenomenon, and they had not. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it's just that I don't know about it. And I would say that just because there's some economic integration at this point in time, think of the United Steelworkers and the Mexican Union Los Mineros, I think is how you put it. I don't know if I pronounced that right. That's worthwhile. That shows that there's some solidarity there, that they're building a common organization where they need to. But it doesn't mean that there's a tri-nationalism any more than the steelworkers unifying with Unite in Britain means that there is British nationalism growing in the United States or American nationalism growing in Britain. It just doesn't mean that at this point in time. It may later on. So while I made those comments on some points that stuck out for me, I must say that this is really one of the best books I've read in a long time. And I think it's very worthwhile for people to look at it. And I think we have to be aware as never before about the role of NAFTA and sort of neoliberalism generally in terms of throwing social rights and decent jobs and public well-being under a crusher when in fact we need to organize like never before to try to get rid of that kind of a system and build a more democratic and socialist system. Thank you.
Sam Gindin. Sam, who is the longtime research director at the Canadian Auto Workers and a great supporter of labor education and activism and mentoring in the labor movement. Sam has followed that work at the Canadian Auto Workers with a time as the Packard Chair of Social Justice at York University. And we're very honored and happy to have him tonight to give his perspective.
Okay. Leo and I didn't actually plan this, but when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about Dick in the 60s. And I was thinking about Dick's role in the free speech movement, where he was one of the leaders, as well as his divisive role, destructive role, according to Todd Gitlin, in SDS. And I actually brought a couple of pictures, which I think are interesting, which I'll pass around afterwards. One is of Dick standing on a car in '64 in Berkeley.
Police car.
Police car. Okay, so yeah, I also want to just congratulate Dick and Edur for this book. And there's two things in particular I really liked about the book. I'll get to the third point later. One is that a lot of discussions about the need for internationalism tend to be moral and fairly abstract. I mean, obviously, if we believe in social justice, it has to be universal, it has to be international. But sometimes it's reduced to slogans. And one of the things that I liked about this is, first of all, that it actually chose a space to investigate this in. It actually said that there's a strategic space in thinking about the Canada-US-Mexico relationship and the contradictions. And I thought that that was very important, rather than just talking about internationalism. And second of all, how historically specific it is. It actually tries to understand what is different about the capitalist classes in each country, what's different about the states, and what's the nature of the labor movements, in addition to the relationship between them. And I think that that's a really crucial point. Now, I'm very nervous a lot of times when I hear people talk about internationalism. It sometimes sounds to me that it's politically correct, and we look at things that look like they're internationalist. And I think sometimes Dick flirts with this as well when he talks about the seeds of, Chris raised this too, the seeds in international, so-called international unions. A lot of what's happening when the trade union movement talks about extending internationalism is actually about extending their failures internationally. Now what I mean by that is that a lot of times the model is just an extension of business unionism internationally, and that's not what we need. I think Teresa had organized a trip for us to Mexico, and it was to meet with the Volkswagen workers. And the idea of internationalism was that we would help the Volkswagen workers raise their wages. I don't think that that's the issue in Mexico. The issue in Mexico is how do you build the class solidarity within Mexico, not how do you create an elite of Mexican workers in an auto plant. so that you can take on questions of the state and questions of building the class. So it's not only that, it's misplaced and it's just an international business unionism sometimes, it's also that it's a diversion from getting to the problems that have to be dealt with at home. So the solution to showing that you're progressive is you say we're going to form an international union, like Unite and Steelworkers. Well, it doesn't address all the questions that Katherine was raising about the real failures at home. And in spite of statements from Trumka that we're in real shit now, it's not so clear to me that there's a depth of understanding about what the problems really are and how profound they are in the very nature of the trade union movement. And finally, when we talk about internationalism, we have to be sober about our limits in developing solidarity within our own country. Tell us something about how hard it is to develop solidarity internationally until you've really transformed your unions domestically. So in Canada, you don't have much solidarity between steelworkers and auto workers. You look at the airline industry, it's divided into all kinds of unions. Border workers are on this horrible strike right now. You think that everybody would see this as their battle. This token contribution from the rest of the labor movement, including the airline unions generally, with some exceptions, but even there, the role of the unions has been so limited. So we have to take that into consideration. So the third thing that I really liked about Dick's book was that he does address this. In chapter 7, he gets into a more fundamental critique of unions. The problem with unions is not just that they don't have an international perspective. It's everything about unions right now. It's the fundamental structure that unions have as sectional organizations that represent a specific group of workers. Even if that specific group of workers is auto workers across the board, so that doesn't solve that problem. Especially when the problems that workers face, again, as Katherine said, are increasingly, they're questions of addressing state power. They're questions of addressing all dimensions of class struggle. So I think what we have to talk about is not so much internationalization, but the transformation of unions, of which the international will become one part. And I think, so part of what I'm emphasizing is I think that internationalization actually begins at home. It begins with forming a different kind of union with a different kind of sensibility at home. And I think there's all kinds of interesting questions that emerge from this book about how we think about class consciousness, particularly of Mexican workers. What does it mean to be a Mexican worker in the US? Do you see yourself as a Mexican worker because you may only be here for part of a while and your real politics and class is in Mexico? Or is it in the United States? Why is it when we see that incredible explosion on May Day, which was Latino workers generally, but included a lot of Mexican workers, what happened to it? And that tells us something about who's actually dominant in those communities. And we can't talk about a Latino community. We have to break that community down into the small businessmen who actually have a lot of hegemony in it. What is the consciousness of workers who come to the United States primarily to get integrated? Primarily for upward mobility, and part of the resistance is when some of that is frustrated. So I think those are the kind of questions that we have to address. And once we begin to address those questions, I think the question that it poses isn't just what the unions should do, which we can talk about, but what kind of a left do we have to build that can contribute to the transformation of unions? And I think that that's an incredible impasse that we don't talk about. It's like we're lefties giving labor advice about what to do, but we're not addressing the fact of our incredible weakness. The difference with the 30s was that the building of the CIO was very much linked to a left, a good part of which was a communist left. So finally, what I think is so crucial about this book, and Leo is getting at this, is it gives us the kind of analytical framework so that we really start thinking about what kind of politics and what kind of a labor movement does that imply.
What does it take? It takes fire in the belly, fire in the belly, let's start with that. What does it take? It takes fire in the belly, fire in the belly, let's work on that. Look down the road from where we are. This is how we get from here to there. Dream of where you want to be, a movement for equality, sharp, strategic, and connected. Together we've seen awful times, need a long picket line. The difference between us and them is we'll sacrifice to change things. No justice, peace. What does it take? It takes fire in the belly, fire in the belly. Let's start with that. What does it take? It takes fire in the belly, fire in the belly. Let's work on that.
You gotta listen more than talk. Start from here and build together as we walk. In our differences, our strength. Later in life comes patience. It's not any one of us. It's every one of us. Going in the same direction.
What does it take? It takes fire in the belly, fire in the belly. Let's start with that. What does it take? It takes fire in the belly, fire in the belly. Let's work on that. It takes a letter in the paper, a letter in the paper. Let's start with that. What does it take? It takes a letter in the paper, fire in the belly. Let's work on that.
A union vision.
What does it take? It takes a union vision, a union vision. Let's start with that. What does it take? It takes a union vision, a letter in the paper, fire in the belly. Let's work on that.
Organizing.
What does it take? It takes organizing, organizing. Let's start with that. What does it take? It takes organizing, a union vision, a letter in the paper, fire in the belly. Let's work on that.
And a coalition.
What does it take? It takes a coalition, a coalition. Let's start with that. What does it take? It takes a coalition, organizing, union vision, letter in the paper, fire in the belly. Let's work on that.
Party for the workers.
What does it take? It takes a party for the workers, a party for the workers. Let's start with that. What does it take? It takes a party for the workers, a coalition, organizing, union vision, letter in the paper, fire